Great. Thanks, everybody, for joining. I am Melissa Newberg. I'm the global head of Intel here at Seerist. And the problems that we're going to talk about today are ones I've kind of lived from both sides as a leader of Intel teams, but also as an analyst producing content for leaders. So I thought we'd start this with a question, and kind of the impetus for having this topic in the first place. Keep hearing from nearly every Intel and security leader that I talk to. And, our teams, many teams are better resourced, better trained, more technologically capable, definitely, than they've ever been before. And so why isn't the right person getting the right intelligence before that decision window closes? And this is really, an age-old dilemma that probably resonates with a lot of people here. Some people call this like the decision gap, the decision advantage, where Intel doesn't reach the right person in the right format with enough organizational trust, which is key behind it, to actually drive that decision. And that is, in fact, sort of a two-sided problem. There's the decision maker that's not getting intelligence in time to act in a way that they can reasonably ingest it. And then there's the analyst, the Intel professional, the security professional whose best work is oftentimes dying in an inbox. Both are probably on this call today, and both are describing sort of that same failure from opposite ends. So today's conversation is really focused on that issue. And we are grounded today in real data from the Clarity Factory's annual CSO survey, which is probably the most rigorous sort of independent benchmark of how we have security leaders experiencing those pressures in real time. The 2026 survey is still open. It's closing this week. So if you are a CSO, a senior security leader, Rachel will share the link before we close out. It's definitely worth your time to take that, and also to read last year's survey and the survey that will come out of this year's as well. And I have the great pleasure of having this conversation with Rachel Briggs today. And she founded the Clarity Factory, and she produces a survey annually. She is one of the most respected researchers in security leadership. She advises CSOs and boards, and she brings independent data that validates and sometimes challenges what practitioners experience on the ground from the CSO perspective. So Rachel, thanks for joining us today.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me. And thank you to Seerist for sponsoring this year's CSO survey. Very grateful for your support. Thank you.
We are happy to. I love the survey. And any chance we can have to have real data to back up the things you are experiencing, in real life, is fantastic. So I'll first, I think it's worth setting the stage before we kind of get into the data in our conversation here. And feel free to drop questions as well into the chat. We can address them as we go or address them at the end. But would love to hear, how you all are thinking about this and questions that you might have that we can address throughout as well. But the operating environment has changed, structurally, and this is not an incremental change. We are used to operating in a world of episodic crises. Something would happen, organizations respond, there's a recovery period, and then the dreaded Q word, a period of quiet. That rhythm is just completely gone. What we have now is really that continuous pressure, geopolitical whiplash, conflict escalation across multiple theaters, trade disruptions, extreme weather, domestic political instability, perhaps in places that used to feel stable, and that just doesn't stop. That volatility is really the baseline now. So what does that actually mean for intelligence and security teams today? It ultimately means that the bottleneck has fundamentally shifted, and access to information kind of used to be the advantage there, knowing things others didn't, having sources others couldn't reach, but that model is eroding very fast, also based, not just on the world, the world around us, but also the technology around us too. That's eroding fast. So when anyone can generate a passable summary in 30 seconds, I know things is not as defensible as it used to be. So that new edge really is, and this is something we continue to hear, that interpretation, that translation, that organizational context that's unique to what the analyst or the operator might know. And that means making, what's available to everyone means something specific for, this organization, this decision, this moment, that identity shift is something I do see, a lot in practitioners now. And the ones that are kind of pulling ahead are the ones that are really thinking about themselves more as advisors versus gatekeepers of information. And that's definitely not a small adjustment from the practitioner side. So Rachel, your survey captures, how CSOs are experiencing this pressure right now from their lens. Would love to hear how what your data shows about the demand for intelligence now from their intelligence teams. How is this changing across the business, and how are they actually building and hiring for this new environment?
Yeah, thank you. The question to ask really. And I will tell you a bit about what I know, a bit about what I don't know. And I'm not an Intel analyst, so I'm coming at this question from maybe a slightly different perspective than some folks on the call. And that's why it's important. I think you and I are having a conversation about this because it's about putting those two sort of lenses on top of one another to then get a really rounded picture. So that's why I'm so grateful to be here. I guess let me just start by sort of some of what I heard last year, some of what I continue to hear in conversations, and then some of what I see when I kind of dip into the data, which I haven't yet analysed properly. But to state the obvious, I mean, there is a growing demand for intel from different parts of the business. Um, we now have leadership at the top of businesses who are as alive as maybe those of us in our community are to some of the issues that are sort of bread and butter to us. I mean, you've only got to look at the front page of the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, or the New York Times on any date of the year, and our issues are their issues, and that's good news and it's bad news, and it means different things for Intel analysts, obviously. But there's definitely an increased demand for the type of stuff that we in our community do. Um, and what I also see married to that, perhaps unsurprisingly, is increased investment by CSOs in the Intel function. It looks different in different places, and that you, Melissa, would have a closer view on this than I do. Many on the calls would. But certainly what I see is different ways of meeting that demand, whether it's an entirely outsourced model of Intel or entirely insourced, depending on which vendors you're using, which information sources, how mature your Intel shop is, how mature the business is to receive that information. So it's a sort of a mixed picture, obviously. I do, one of the things that, we're going to talk a lot about, how do we make the product, the service, the offering of the Intel team as tailored as it possibly can be to the business. And I guess one of the things that has to be prefaced right up front is, you used the word gatekeeping earlier, is the danger of CSOs gatekeeping to the rest of the business. So we'll maybe kind of come back to that at various points during the conversation, because I think if on the one hand we're saying to Intel analysts, you've got to understand your customer, you've got to tailor what you do. If a leadership within the corporate security function is going, that's my relationship, don't go anywhere near the head of supply chain or the head of our Asia Pac business, or whatever, that's a problem for that issue of tailoring and really getting stuff to be bespoke. So I just think it's worth kind of prefacing and understanding that. In terms of hiring the right people, it's a really interesting dilemma that you paint, and I think I'll cast ahead to what this might mean going forward, because I think maybe that would kind of be pose some interesting challenges for the community. Because if you're right that actually the key differentiator for Intel professionals now is not what do you know and who do you know. That's not to say it's not important anymore, of course, but it's more, how can you tell us what we should do, or how can you advise us? How can you help be part of the solution to our problems? Then it could mean some quite different things in terms of skill set. It could mean that if you think about the sort of the sort of the value chain of the Intel profession, um, you know, less emphasis on the getting hold of stuff and processing, and more emphasis maybe on spotting trends, understanding impact, and communicating in a way that the business can really understand and do something with. So I think that skills arc, I think good Intel professionals have always needed all of the above, but maybe we've concentrated more on one end of the spectrum in our hiring practices. Where do Intel professionals come from? Who do they know? What's their network, etc. maybe we either need to recruit for and or train for some of that wider set of skills around kind of effective understanding of different perspectives in the business and then different types of communication to really hit business need.
You had pointed out, you sort of look at any headline and you can see, how the impact of the sort of geopolitical landscape now. I think it was absolutely fascinating in the last 2 weeks how the singular Anthropic job ad for a geopolitical intel analyst got such traction beyond, LinkedIn. Obviously, I'm sure they have piles of applicants as well, but the fact that that in and of itself was a talking point for people outside of outer space, I think is really telling to just how significant, this really is. And if, a company that's perceived as sort of leading on their front, like Anthropic, is leaning in that direction, then that really speaks to, what's happening in the wider industry.
It does, and it means, enormous opportunities for our community. Um, Now, being able to capitalize on those opportunities is not a given. Just because you think you have the right skill set does not mean, we'll come onto this probably, but it doesn't mean necessarily you're going to be the choice to solve those problems. But it does mean that you go into this new period, which is kind of, as you sort of tired me out, your introduction actually, because, we are all exhausted. We are all kind of reading too much. We are all living at a pace that's not sustainable. So it does open up opportunities, but it means we've got to be really razor sharp, focused, and on top of our game to make sure we are the solution that business leaders choose.
I think you and I had briefly talked about this, and it's a little bit of an aside, but we both felt it kind of important to just quickly address it. There is the human dimension, to what we talk about here. And we both felt strongly about, highlighting that because we do have, analysts, operators that are writing reports from conflict zones. They're living real time inside the very situations that they're analyzing in a very different kind of way, now than maybe ever before. And you still have teams covering hostilities every single day, on top of that from other places. And that sort of question of how you structure, place, how you support those people, is really a leadership question that I think many organizations haven't maybe fully reckoned with quite yet. But I'm very personally mindful of this, teams living and working within this kind of environment. And you and I had talked briefly about how, you've supported people in similar situations like this, and what this kind of continuous pressure can mean for
Mm.
those people doing this kind of work. Maybe just if you can briefly touch on that and what you think, CSOs and leaders should be thinking about with respect to that.
Yeah, and I'll just give a bit of context because there may be many people on the line who understandably don't know about my career history. But one of the things I had the great privilege of doing for about 15 years was running two organizations that called Hostage International and Hostage US, which is what brought me to the US for a few years. And these were nonprofits that supported hostages and their families during and after kidnappings and arbitrary detentions. And so I was directly volunteer. I was running the organizations, but I was directly volunteering to help family members going through this. I was then directly volunteering to help hostages who had returned from captivity, and as you can imagine, quite a long road to recovery. And I was managing a team of volunteers, and latterly a colleague of mine was managing that team of volunteers who were doing that really important but very difficult and sometimes quite draining work of helping people who are in crisis and are in need. And it taught me a lot about myself actually. It taught me a lot about what it is to do a really important job professionally in a way that enables you to continue to not just survive but thrive as a human being, and both of those are equally important. And I have to say I was didn't necessarily model the kind of behavior that I was asking my team to take care of yourself and take breaks. And I was probably the worst at modeling that kind of behavior, which I recognized. But we sort of we had to get in place a program with the board's absolute full support as well as they including them putting financial money behind this, which for a non-profit board is always very careful with the money. But they recognized how critical this was, which was a very big tick in terms of their leadership. But it was about sort of a number of different things. First, it was about as individuals taking care of ourselves, so making sure that we did continue to do those things in our lives which gave us meaning, which gave us release, etc. It was also about having quite a structured peer support system. It's wonderful when your colleagues go, "Hey, Melissa, how you doing?" Um, but and that's great, and it's lovely that we all hear that from our colleagues. And I know this is the kind of community where we do. But we had quite formal peer support structures in place. We use something in the UK called TRIM, which is a form of sort of a very formal way of looking out for one another, and it's structured. And we had professional support. So if anybody ever said, I need some professional support, no questions asked. They got it because it was so desperately important to us. And then that sort of leadership modeling behavior. And so it was not something that took a lot of designing. It wasn't something that cost a lot to do, but the act of having it in a very structured way meant that everybody kind of had to opt out rather than opt in. And it was very much expected that you do have to look after yourself, and we expect you to look after yourself. Because I think one of the most insidious things is when you're in that kind of position is that you think, well, it's not me that's been a hostage, so who am I to complain? Or, it's not me who's living in a war zone right now, but I'm writing about it. And that actually can exacerbate the impact of trauma on you, your inability to recognize what you're going through. So I have great sympathy for the Intel community doing a difficult job in a time when it is relentless. And I think more CSOs should have those kind of structured programs in place. It's a non-negotiable as far as I'm concerned for the whole team, not just the Intel, but don't forget the Intel team.
I think you said it quite well. It's not necessarily your a personal resilience problem. It's really a structural kind of situation to think about here. So yeah, thank you for the perspective on that. Kind of, we already mentioned this, but I think it's one of the more significant parts of this discussion, the idea of the demand surface for Intel has never been larger, as evidenced by a singular job ad getting such global attention in the way it has. Boards want geopolitical briefings. Supply chain wants to understand their vulnerabilities and visibility ahead of sourcing decisions. There's so many parts of the business that are all happening simultaneously, often, in organizations that are also shrinking headcount. They're being asked to do more with less. What I'm seeing in some of the most, effective teams right now is really like a deliberate expansion of their remit, and not because they were necessarily asked to, but because they recognized the demand was there and they were positioned to serve it. And so, they went and did the fact finding and the relationship building, and they did. And that means security and intelligence sort of stepping more into informing a supply chain decision, or a protective intel team feeding into a comm strategy. And that's maybe not the norm, but is increasingly becoming so. So what used to be a sort of a siloed function is becoming like connective tissue between and across the business in different kind of ways. But that really only works if the intel and security teams are actually reaching parts of the business and then also getting that information back in return. And I think that's where the gap kind of becomes pretty visible. So the survey has some really striking data on some of those unserved areas and organizational gaps that explain where Intel isn't connecting into parts of the business that need it most, to be that company asset, as you've described. And so maybe you can walk us through, what you found from that perspective. And then I love the data point that we had talked about, Intel needing the flow back into into the business, and then also back into Intel. It's a two-way flow to really make that company asset successful.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, wow, big questions. I mean, the sort of let me start with the question about where else Intel can serve, and I would say I'm open to being challenged on this, but I think our data shows us that the most common place that Intel serves is the corporate security function itself. So it's a sort of it's the home team, right? Um, we've got some questions coming this year about where else it serves in the business. I'm excited to share that in a few months' time. But as you say, the potential is really quite significant to serve other parts of the business. You mentioned one I would definitely point to, which is supply chain. You know, the data on, I spend a lot of my time actually looking at business data as opposed to security data and understanding how is business changing and what kind of, how are business leaders thinking about risk and how are they changing their businesses and et cetera, et cetera. And some of the, there's very stark data about the some of the wholesale changes that businesses are taking or are considering taking around, for example, supply chain, which is hardly surprising given some of the stuff that is happening in certain parts of the world, which is blocking supply chain. And I'm not just talking about what has been happening over the last few weeks, which has blocked obviously one of the most important waterways in the world. But that those are patterns that have been, certainly on the agenda for many years. And it's worth keeping an eye on what those business trends are and asking yourselves as a community, how could we serve to that need? And I think I don't see enough, I don't pretend to be in the weeds on this, but I don't see enough connectivity between Intel teams and supply chain, for example, where there are just huge, obvious areas of connectivity. Now, the devil is in the detail, and you do have to get into the weeds and say, well, how does our supply chain work? And what are the exact opportunities to input information and so on and so forth. So how the mechanics of how you actually do that in practice can be tailored to your own business need. But if there were ever a time for an Intel team to be asking itself, could we do anything to help our supply chain colleagues? I think I've never seen one as acute as right now. So I'm sure my information is somewhat out of date because I'm sure events over the last several months have kind of probably forced some of those conversations even where they weren't existing already. The other the other that I would encourage folks to explore, and I've talked about this before, is around cybersecurity, because from my experience, there are kind of both functions have their own kind of what they would call Intel functions, but actually they look and feel incredibly different. And where the equivalent within the cyber team is sort of a lot more technical and a lot more detail oriented. The corporate security equivalent is much more big picture. It's looking at longer term trends. It's thinking about how the world's changing and so on and so forth. And they are exaggerated versions because both are doing much more than that. But actually, they're highly complementary kind of skill sets and perspectives. And actually, the organizations that are clients of mine that I work with who not necessarily have converged teams, although it's sort of more acute in those teams, but where the physical and the cybersecurity teams have managed to get some kind of connectivity, help to a greater or lesser extent, find that actually the Intel piece is one of those bits of, you use the term connective tissue, where actually you put those two capabilities together, that's pretty special. And if you think about the challenges that are there on the cyber side of things around digital networks staying up. So many organizations that I know are sort of absolutely paranoid about systems going down. They are all exercising like crazy for, what if we lose everything? What must we have a sort of a digital twin of, et cetera, et cetera. There again is one of business's most critical obsessions right now, and an opportunity for, I think, corporate security Intel professionals not to come in and say, we have all of the answers to that, but I think to say, actually, we can complement very nicely the expertise that you've got to really add some rich depth to that exercise. So I could go on. I mean, for instance, some really interesting stuff I think to be done, in terms of relationships with like government affairs colleagues, community relations colleagues, as the threat from sort of social and political unrest increases. I've seen some companies that do some really, really interesting collaborations between their community relations teams and the Intel shop within their corporate security function. And once they understand one another, which can take a little bit of working through, they go, oh my goodness, I had no idea we've got this expertise in the business. This is fantastic. We now don't think we can do what we do without you. So get out there, explore, ask questions, demonstrate. And there are so many opportunities. I couldn't possibly list them all right now.
It's really cybersecurity almost seems like the convergence, which is like one of the, those hot button words that everybody says, convergence of physical security and cybersecurity together. And conferences called convergence, but actually is just one sort of microcosm of really what a physical security and intel team could do across multiple parts of the business, kind of a model for things you can do with other teams and ways to support other teams in a more impactful way, I think. And I really love the idea of being able to get that, feedback into an Intel team and then being able to tailor and kind of customize what you're doing in an even greater way. And then to your point, you're sort of invited to the table, and you're at the table with the decision makers in a way that's different instead of just, producing intelligence and it sits in an inbox and you're not quite sure what that means
Yeah.
or where it's gone. But you get so embedded deeply into the business that the business feeds you what you need to serve it well, and then you actually have a seat at that table at the end of the day to be proactively like helping make decisions and drive outcomes.
Yeah, and I'll say a little bit more about that actually, because the really important point to make is to not wait to be invited, which I'm sure nobody on this call is doing. But it's such a basic point and it's so important. Um, I was chatting last week to somebody who's the EMEA lead for a large multinational who's not long into the role actually. And she has taken a really, really, really super proactive approach to building relationships, including she mentioned to me with the head of supply chain. And she said that, 3 weeks before the conflict with Iran started, she was desperately trying to get this relationship up and running. And then, of course, 3 weeks later, it was so self-evident to the head of supply chain that this was going to be one of that person's most critical relationships going forward. But she wouldn't have been anywhere near helping supply chain if she hadn't have just gotten out into the business, taken the initiative, thought to herself, right, I'm okay, I've understood the business. I can understand supply chain is critical. I understand I've got something to give. So I'm just going to keep knocking on that door and knocking on that door. And I'm getting a blank face from the head of supply chain. But there will be a moment when that person kind of says, thank goodness you knocked on my door. Now can we do some business? Which is exactly what. So I think, doing that, really taking the time to learn the business in the way that you take the time to learn your region or learn your country or learn the activist group you're covering or the terrorist network you're covering, really understand it, read the annual reports, get on the investor calls, be at all those town hall meetings, etc., because that is your business. And there's a certain amount you can absorb without having to get into the room. And so you should absolutely do that and become obsessed with really understanding the business that you're there to serve. And then I think the final thing I would say on it, and you've used that kind of term sort of two-way a number of times, which I think is a really critical thing reset for I think for all of us actually, whatever our role when we're producing stuff. Um, and one of the things I'm increasingly advising corporate security leaders on is about the importance of having a sort of a strategic communications plan. And I think Intel analysts need to have something similar as well, which is who are my key interlocutors in the business? And a strategic communications plan isn't about broadcasting, it is about two-way because for it to be strategic, you have to have understood who those people are and you have to have some channel from them back to you as well to keep learning. I mean, that's just the inherent nature of a strategic comms plan versus a broadcast comms plan. So I think, having that kind of in place and really being very intentional about that, I think is a prelude to then some of the conversation I'm sure we'll have about what products in what way and what language and how long and all that. But that it all starts with that, I think.
Let's do that right now. Perfect, perfect little segue right into it. The product design, the communications, problems, issues, challenges. What does it actually look like to build intelligence products for the decision maker rather than the analyst, exactly as you described, sort of ingesting your own products, which is fine, but how are you building for that decision maker? And I find a lot of times sort of products can be built backwards when you think about that instead. So they start with the data in front of the analyst, which makes sense, from like a tradecraft perspective, and then you work outward. But actually, a better approach might be to start with the decision that needs to be made. That what is the decision maker, what decision are they trying to make? And then, you work backwards from that to the evidence that actually matters for them to make that kind of decision. And I think that's where we sort of collectively need to design for the cognitive load of our leaders as well. So it's one thing, the GSOC deciding whether to call the CSO at 2 o'clock in the morning. They don't need exhaustive context. They just need to know the orientation and, what do I need to do right now? And does this cross thresholds and that kind of thing. But not every stakeholder group needs the same product either. And, who needs the full analysis versus who needs a recommendation and, being able to map that out as you write as well and work to build the right kind of products for the right kind of teams is just as important to what you're describing. So thought it was super interesting what you found from the communication standpoint, and it makes perfect sense, but I think is kind of counterintuitive sometimes when you think about intel and security work and how high storytelling ranked as a competency that CSOs look for on their team. So would love for you to talk more about that, and then maybe with the ultimate goal of sort of getting to, what you think that tells us about how the business wants to consume Intel.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the data points that we got last year was we asked CSOs, we gave them a choice of several things. So it was kind of limited, but we asked them, aside from budget and not having enough people, which everybody always wants more of. So we knew that was a given. We said, which of these things are the biggest obstacles to the effectiveness of your function? And by a country mile, the most important obstacle was the business doesn't understand security. And we can have a discussion about A, whether the business should understand security, B, whether that means, what all of that means. It could mean lots of different things. But I think ultimately, depending on how you analyze, I think regardless of how you analyze that and what you think it means, I think what it does mean is that security has got a communications problem. And it's either a perceived problem on our behalf, on our part, or it's a real problem in terms of the business. But we've definitely got a communications problem. And I personally argue that it isn't this isn't the business's job to understand security. It's our job to get them the information they need to make the right decisions and do what they need to do properly. So I don't think putting the emphasis on them getting up to speed with us is in any way, shape, or form the right way to go about this. But if you agree with my premise that we have a communications problem, then the sort of the next question is, and how do you overcome that? And what I see many what I think a mistake is that can sometimes be made is to say, well, we'll need to communicate more what we do, which usually means describing all of the different teams we've got within the corporate security team, all the different processes they engage in. And this is what I do for a living, and that even turns me off, right? And I can't follow it. And I don't, it's not engaging, even if this is what you do for a living. It's like a shopping list. And instead, it's harder work. But what you need to do instead is to think about communicating from the standpoint of what they need from us. And there's a kind of a Venn diagram here in its simplest terms, which is what are the assets we've got on one side of the Venn diagram, and on the other side of the Venn diagram is what are the problems that the business gives a damn about. And ideally, what you find in the middle of the Venn diagram is some problems that need to be solved and some assets that we've got to bring to the table to solve them. And I think our conversation has hinted towards the fact that I do think we Intel team is one of those prime assets right now that can solve a really critical set of problems for the business. And then the question is how. And the thing that is so compelling about storytelling, which in and of itself is sort of people think you're kind of it's kumbaya and it's about, sitting around campfires and all that good stuff and sort of maybe being a bit self-indulgent and maybe telling old war stories. It's not any of that. It's about a structure that is emotionally engaging, that when you kind of tell somebody about something that happened, it by stringing together the core components in a very particular structure that is aimed at impact, emotional connection, and a sort of a leaning in with a desire to then understand what the conclusion is and what I have to do about it. That's why storytelling is compelling because, nobody is, after you've kind of presented your PowerPoint on, whatever it might be, nobody is then going to tell anybody about what was in Melissa's PowerPoint. But if Melissa tells a really compelling story about, let me tell you about, what one of our team told us who's based in UAE at the moment, suddenly you've got an audience that is listening, is engaged, cares, feels like they have skin in the game as well, and is much more likely to remember that and to think about it, reflect it, and then go pass it on to somebody else. And so it takes a bit of effort. I mean, obviously you've got to learn this particular skill set and the structure to use. We run storytelling workshops. I'm not selling them. I'm just saying lots of people run them. But what we see when we put security professionals through this, and we've had Intel professionals, is that actually it's quite a relief to get a structure. And I I kid you not, you see people around the table suddenly listening to one another better, being more interested in what one another has to say. And that's people who are on the same team together who suddenly understand what their colleague. Well, now, if it takes that to understand what your colleagues are doing, imagine how difficult it is to try and communicate with people who have nothing to do with security. And perhaps one of the greatest endorsements was um, somebody who'd been through our course last year at some point, kind of almost ran across a sort of a conference room to me a few months ago and said, "Our stories are coming back to us." Now, isn't that a sign of success? Because I can guarantee none of his PowerPoints were coming back to him. But because they now had stories, they were doing the rounds. And when other people start telling your stories back to you, you know that you've been successful. So I think there are all sorts of different communications methods that you can adopt, which are far more effective than I think some of the ones that we most commonly use. So I pick on storytelling, it's not the only one, but I think as a community, and particularly as Intel professionals, we've got the most compelling stories to tell. And, replacing tons of analysis and text, maybe with the right story for the right executive, will be the thing that convinces them that they should trust you, wants to come back to you next time, and actually maybe changes their decision as a result of it. Because the reality is executives have got, seconds, minutes, they've definitely not got hours to make decisions. And so getting in quick with a cautionary tale, something that really neatly summarizes the complexity of the situation, but in a really simple way, I think is a huge elevator for what the Intel community does.
We were very ambitious in thinking we would get to talk about AI. So I think we'll just abandon that because I think this is a good transition point to give some more practical advice in terms of I love the storytelling piece and I think that makes so much logical sense. So I think good time to bring it back to a practical place since we do only have a few minutes left somehow already. I'll do a few things kind of from my side from that sort of practitioner lens before I hand it to you, Rachel, to do the same from your side. What are ultimately some truly like realistic things that intel and security teams can do to sort of maximize the impact of what, their intel, how their intel is presented and, reaching the right kind of people. I loved, and it was the first thing on top of my list, is to map out who your actual customers are inside the business. I think that makes a ton of sense to do that stakeholder mapping. And I would bet a lot of maybe CSOs are doing it, but I would really bet a lot of Intel teams and security teams are not doing it themselves. I think that audit alone will tell you more about the gap than sort of anything. The second, and we kind of already said this too, but definitely build that two-way relationship deliberately and do that relationship building, which I think isn't always something we focus on as Intel professionals, but it is so crucial that you can't really wait for them, to offer it. You have to go out and proactively sort of seek that relationship. And as you said, exactly, stop waiting to be invited in necessarily. And the last one I would kind of point out is to measure your impact as if you can. I know that that often is hard and not necessarily the output. So, you're giving lots of things to lots of people, and that's the metric versus what is the outcome and what kind of decisions have I informed? Has someone come back around and told me that story? That's kind of an outcome in and of itself. If that information is, getting around to the right people in the business in the right kind of way, that can be potentially an outcome. And the last one I'd leave before I turn over to you, Rachel, is to ruthlessly prioritize what you're doing as an Intel team. So iterate quickly. Most intelligence teams are already stretched. So you're adding now proactive relationship building, business calibrated products, two-way sort of data work and understanding. So you really do have to go and cut out the things that are not hitting and not working for you, in ways to prioritize the things that are. And I'll turn it over to you now, Rachel.
Yeah, gosh, I mean, you've covered some of the most important things. And, on that stakeholder mapping, I don't think most corporate security departments are doing this. Most leaders are not doing this. So I think, maybe some of our Intel colleagues could lead the way in that. It's about understanding who those individuals are, maybe creating personas for different groups within the business, and each persona will tell you kind of what does this personal group do, how do they best consume information, what questions would they be asking you if you were in front of them, not what information could you give them, but how would they phrase those questions. One of the things that I do with clients is kind of conduct what we call business needs analysis. I mean, adopt that kind of idea where you go out and you have incredibly illuminating. You sit down and you say, what do you think we do? What are the problems that are vexing you right now? And if I was going to help you solve that problem, what would be the best way for me to do that? And people will tell you exactly. And if you can't get to the decision maker, get to somebody that reports to the decision maker. Yeah, there is always a way. So I think there's that. Don't. One of the most basic things is don't assume that the business knows what you do or even that you're there. I've told this story a million times, but I was running a one-day workshop for a client. FTSE 50 company, huge. Security was so critical that the CFO was in the room all day. Um, and at one point, he put his hand up and said, Rachel, I understand why the board is interested in geopolitics, but why is my security team interested in geopolitics? And of course, all of our jaws hit the ground. But I'm so glad he asked the question. And it was a really good reminder that this is what we're all obsessed with and we do it all day, every day. But, you know, he and the board, up until that point in time, didn't even think that their team had that capability. And they soon then did realize, and the relationship changed. So don't assume that. So shout about what it is you do. Don't wait to be invited in. And just think really, I love the fact that you picked on being really ruthless about A, what to stop doing, because we didn't talk about AI, but of course, the big elephant in the room is AI. And there's lots of all of our jobs that we don't need to necessarily do anymore. We can automate to get to the juicier bits. And actually, it's the juicier bits that the business are really interested in where Intel's concerned. So think ruthlessly about what you can cut out. Don't have assumptions about, well, this is how I've always done my job and this is so precious, I must continue doing it. Because the quicker you can get to the real kind of hard edge bit, the better. And really just be sort of hard on yourself and say, am I really, is this really the question they want answered? Is this really the best way to do it? And make sure you're coordinated with one another, because I'll leave this example was a CSA who I know really well said that she realized that her Intel shop had a problem when something had happened in a country. It doesn't matter where, it doesn't matter when. And within a few hours, 15 different intel reports had been blasted out to various different people. And you know, that's an extreme example. I'm sure even the most organized intel groups have got sort of a much minor version of that. But just, people are busy enough. They certainly don't need 15 versions of the same message from you because you're disorganized. So I'm sure that doesn't apply to anyone on this call, but I thought that was quite funny.
Yeah, that's that it's an interesting twist on ruthlessly prioritizing now to say, stop doing some things, but then the second piece of it is, do you still need to do it and can you outsource it to a tool
Mm.
or to AI some way to automate it for you? I mean, it's a fascinating dynamic we're in now on that front. Um, we are at the end of our time. Thank you so much, Rachel, for your time and your insights. I highly recommend going and reviewing the 2025 survey and looking at what's to come for this year if you haven't already. I love to read it. And if you are, CSO, senior security leader, please go take the survey. It is open until Thursday, I believe. The link is in the chat. So please go do that. The more data, the better. And thank you so much again, Rachel, for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.